Hello, everyone. Before we commence, kindly indicate your listening location and the current time in the comments section. Remember to subscribe and leave a like. Your support is appreciated in advance. Now, without further delay, extinguish the lights, don your headphones, and let us plunge directly into the terror. Story 1. The Catskills camping trip and a haunting revelation. During the summer of 2013, when we were in our mid-20s, my friend Rachel extended an invitation to join her boyfriend, and a few of his acquaintances on a camping expedition to the Catskill Mountains. The season was proving to be exceptionally pleasant and dry, and I was well aware that her boyfriend and his companions were laid-back individuals, making the proposition appealing to anyone. However, for me personally, the prospect of embarking on my very first camping trip filled me with immense excitement, far beyond mere enthusiasm. The reason this was my inaugural experience traces back to a period in my life that I no longer recall, the narrative of which I've received secondhand from my mother. To this day, my mother remains deeply upset that my father permitted the incident. Here is how the story unfolds. When I was merely 3 years old, some of my father's former college friends inquired if he wished to join them for several hours of barbecuing at one of New York's state parks. He agreed, which led to my accompanying him as a toddler. Apparently, while my father and his associates were grilling ribeyes and engaging in casual banter, I, yours truly, embarked on a small, unauthorized exploration. Subsequently, when my father and his friends became aware of my unauthorized excursion, they descended into a complete state of panic. They sprinted through the park as if possessed, desperately searching for me. When they finally located me, I was wailing with such intensity that they heard me long before they saw me. I did not cease my indignation either. I remained furious even upon our return home, which is how my mother discovered that my father had nearly lost me during a barbecue outing to the woods with friends. And with that, my mother developed a pervasive anxiety regarding my proximity to any type of forest or heavily wooded area, as though the entire experience had instilled in her an irrational apprehension. This fear translated into a strict prohibition against hiking, camping, and most definitively, summer camp. And it is this context, ladies and gentlemen, that explains my overwhelming eagerness to receive that particular invitation. Ultimately, Rachel and her boyfriend decided that we would journey to a location known as Papton Reservoir for an extended weekend. Papton was situated 12 miles from the nearest town, yet with Highway 30 traversing its southern shoreline, it offered convenient accessibility. The area featured a couple of cabins and campgrounds, yet retained sufficient seclusion to evoke a sense of wildness. At least for a group of city dwellers, it felt untamed, and to us, wild signified enjoyment. We drove up towards the culmination of July, with the 5 of us snugly packed into Rachel's old Honda, continuing our drive until we discovered a small peninsula boasting a parking lot, a designated campground, and a boat launch. A pair of cabins existed on the opposite side of the highway, but aside from those, there was nothing but the reservoir, the highway, and what appeared to be boundless woodland stretching beyond. We remained within our small peninsula for a period, unloading the vehicle and establishing our campsite. Following a campfire meal of beans and hot dogs, we consumed a few beers as the sun descended, then retired to our sleeping bags. The subsequent morning, we proceeded to the shore in groups of 1 or 2 for an early cleansing. As the male members of our party occupied themselves by skipping stones across the water, Rachel and I resolved to explore the opposing side of the highway. I was keen to investigate the woods. It felt like an entirely different, enchanting realm to me, even at my age. However, our brief stroll served an additional objective. As we traversed a short, unpaved road primarily lined with vacant cabins, Rachel divulged her intense yearning for motherhood. She expressed a desire to commence a family while she was still within her prime childbearing years. but her boyfriend did not appear to be anywhere near prepared for such a significant responsibility. Apparently, they had discussed the matter, and Rachel wished to discontinue her birth control, but she would not do so until her boyfriend began treating the entire subject with seriousness. He asserted that he was, while she believed he was not, and we continued to converse about the matter as we moved away from the cabins and deeper into the forest. Given my inherent apprehension of becoming disoriented in the woods, a fear not entirely irrational considering my past, I carried my compass, and Rachel playfully mocked me because I was almost incessantly checking our bearing. I humorously remarked that since she was so preoccupied with the trajectory of her relationship, it fell upon me to be concerned with the direction of her hike. She merely rolled her eyes as I chuckled softly. Yet after a few more moments of walking, my laughter subsided. I distinctly recall pausing abruptly in the middle of a path and then becoming profoundly silent. Rachel inquired what had come over me, but I was unable to articulate a response. I wished to, but the words would not materialize. And when I finally managed to speak, this is what I conveyed to her. Around the time I entered middle school, I began to experience recurrent nightmares. My mother hypothesized that they were a form of delayed trauma response to becoming lost in those woods during my early childhood, while my father posited that they were a manifestation of my anxieties regarding the transition to a new school. I possessed no understanding of why I was experiencing them. I simply knew that waking up each night with my sheets drenched in cold sweat was hellish. In these dreams, I would be walking through woods that resembled dark fairy tales, all twisted roots and branches devoid of leaves. Then I would encounter a small stone house. It was so diminutive that it could not have contained more than a single room inside. The interior appeared utterly dark, as if whatever resided within was absorbing all available light. In that nightmare, I would desire to flee, but I was immobilized. It felt as though my feet had grown roots, affixing me to the spot as something shuffled into view from the periphery of my vision. It was a creature with skin akin to tree bark and hair resembling flames. Then, as it stumbled towards the tiny stone house, it would invariably grin at me before disappearing into the darkness within. It was that smile which used to terrify me profoundly. The creature had blood smeared all over its teeth and dripping down its chin, as though it had just consumed one small girl and still had capacity for another. However, instead of dragging me inside, the creature would simply turn its back and walk into the gloom. Yet I was still gripped by an overwhelming sensation of absolute dread because in my nightmare I knew that sooner or later I would enter the darkness entirely on my own, whether I wished to or not, and the creature would be patiently awaiting my arrival. I am confident that many of you can now comprehend why that nightmare caused me such intense fear, especially given that I experienced it at least 2 or 3 times a week for nearly 2 years. My mother eventually arranged a visit to a child psychologist, but none of her recommendations seemed to offer assistance. Then, one day, when I was a high school sophomore, the nightmares simply ceased. The psychologist attributed it to the natural progression of events, suggesting that the sudden cessation of the nightmares was likely due to my feeling much more settled at school. I was so relieved that they had stopped that I did not genuinely care why. Over the subsequent years, reminders of the dream became progressively less frequent. With the pressures of high school, it faded into the recesses of my mind, and there it remained for perhaps 7 or 8 years until I was walking through the woods and it all came rushing back to me. The reason it resurfaced so powerfully was that the scenery felt precisely identical to that of my nightmare from all those years ago. It was not a debilitating form of shock. I did not burst into tears or plead to turn back. However, having that sensation strike me directly, having everything appear so uncannily familiar, was undeniably a freaky experience. Rachel conversely observed me with a look indicating uncertainty of what to say. To be honest, I understood. We were both highly rational, skeptical individuals, averse to anything remotely supernatural. And yet, there I was, discussing an old nightmare as if it were memories from a past life. She maintained that expression for a moment before inquiring, "Is everything all right with you?" I was fine, or at least I believed I was. As we continued our walk, I recounted to her the comprehensive ban on woodland activities that my mother had imposed during my childhood. I recall Rachel laughing and remarking, "It's all starting to make sense now. You're basically an agoraphobic." At the time, I believed she was correct. In a sense, I still believe she was correct. It's just not the same kind of right that I initially perceived as we traversed those woods. As we retraced our steps toward camp, that peculiar sensation in the pit of my stomach seemed to dissipate, and I began to enjoy myself once more. I reasoned that talking it through with Rachel had significantly helped, and it was my first time walking through a forest in nearly 20 years. So perhaps it truly was just my mind playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. Something was out there, simply waiting for me to discover it. We then had lunch, relaxed on the shore for a couple of hours, basking in the sun, and subsequently went for a swim to build up an appetite for dinner. Later, while gathered around the campfire, Rachel playfully joked about my little déjà vu experience during our morning hike. It was a very good-natured attempt at humor, not intended to be mean, but her comments ignited a broader conversation that, thanks to her boyfriend's friends, touched upon topics like past lives, remote viewing, and other seemingly illogical subjects. Or at least it seemed illogical until I began to contemplate it. Perhaps it was the alcohol that led me to consider they might be right in some respect, but I had experienced déjà vu before. What I felt on that hike, however, was exceptionally potent. If standard déjà vu were akin to a common beer, then my experience was like straight, pure liquor. Same general category, just far more intense. I awoke the following morning feeling considerably more rational. We replicated our morning ritual of descending to the shore with our towels, soap, and bathing suits to wash away any lingering mental fogginess. We then enjoyed breakfast while deciding on our Saturday activities, ultimately agreeing to embark on an extended hike into the woods. Since I felt restored to my usual self, I was exceedingly eager to return to the trails, and the next couple of hours were simply wonderful. The weather was excellent, Rachel's boyfriend and his companions were delightful company and truly perfect gentlemen, and the trails were not overly rugged or demanding for what amounted to my first genuine hike. We packed ourselves some lunch consisting of crackers, jerky, and granola bars. I know I consumed an enormous amount of water because it wasn't long before I needed to relieve myself. I felt a little self-conscious about being outdoors around others, so much so that I ended up creating at least 50 or 60 yards of distance between myself and the group before I felt comfortable enough to lower my shorts. When I finally found a suitable spot, I attended to my business, pulled up my shorts, and then instinctively glanced over my shoulder just to ensure I was still alone. I looked one way, then the other, and that's when I noticed something about the treetops in the near distance. How oddly familiar they appeared. Then the longer I gazed, the more that chilling sensation of déjà vu slowly began to creep back. I repeatedly admonished myself to remain still, that I was grappling with some kind of mental health issue, and that I would regret not exercising greater caution. But in the end, I simply could not restrain myself. I had to ascertain why I was experiencing such feelings, and at that moment only the woods seemed to hold any answers. So I walked toward the strangely familiar treetops, the trunks of which were concealed behind a low rise. And then, as I ascended that rise, I suddenly felt myself beginning to feel faint, because what I saw was impossible. It was a small concrete structure, perhaps shoulder height and only a few feet wide, with a slanted concrete roof shaped like an inverted V. The entrance was quite small but deep enough to shroud its furthest point in a haze of darkness. I had seen it before. It did not look precisely the same as I recalled, but I had certainly seen it before, hundreds of times, in fact, in that horrifying, repetitive nightmare I had worked so diligently to forget. And I simply could not believe it. All those years of thinking it was something my imagination had concocted, and it had been real the entire time. I can barely articulate the sensation because the structure was not an exact replica of the one from the nightmare. It wasn't a little stone cottage with a door and a window and all that. Yet simultaneously, I just somehow knew, as if it had ignited some long-dormant synapse in my brain that proclaimed, "We've seen this before." But if I had seen it before, if I had seen it in my nightmares, what then of the monster I envisioned? The one with skin like bark and hair like fire? Being the skeptic that I am, and even though I was 99% certain that no such supernatural creature exists in the world, the intensely vivid feeling of déjà vu had me so unnerved that, for a fleeting moment, I found myself terrified that something was about to emerge from the structure's shadows. Obviously, that did not transpire because unless one counts grizzly bears and tigers, monsters are not real. However, curiosity propelled me closer and closer to that structure until I was finally just a few feet from its entrance. As I mentioned, it extended quite deeply, so deep that I could not see all the way inside without crouching down and peering in, allowing my eyes to adjust to the darkness. When I did so, I could discern the outline of something obscured by layers of dead leaves and small branches. It felt as though I was at the culmination of a journey spanning years. I could not simply stand up and depart, no matter how intensely the feeling of dread burned within my chest. And so I leaned in further and brushed away some of the foliage covering the shape, revealing a boot. It appeared ancient, as though it had been there for years, perhaps even decades. I do not know what compelled me, but I resolved to reach in and simply pull it out. But when I did so and tugged it free, a length of bone accompanied it. I knew it was not merely an animal bone, not because I am an expert in anatomy, but because of the way it shifted precisely as I moved the boot, as if I had disturbed something that had been resting for a very long time. I recoiled immediately as that magnetic feeling of curiosity transformed into one of overwhelming revulsion, and I stood up and ran all the way back to Rachel and the group, where I breathlessly recounted what I had just witnessed. I did not mention my childhood nightmares or that strange feeling of having seen or been there before. There was no time for anything of that nature because there was something very real within that peculiar concrete structure. I requested that someone dial 911, but Rachel's boyfriend and his friends insisted on examining the bones before making any calls. And I understand. I don't believe they doubted me so much as they struggled to comprehend what I was conveying. After all, we had already established that I was a complete novice when it came to hiking and camping. But when I asserted that I was certain it was not an animal bone, I know they must have felt a great deal of skepticism, and therefore wished to see it for themselves. Well, we trekked all the way out to the trees I had recognized and that peculiar concrete playhouse-like structure. When they peered inside, they had almost the exact same shocked reaction as I did. Subsequently, whoever's cell phone had reception ended up contacting the authorities. We had to wait for approximately an hour for them to arrive. When they did, 2 police officers pulled over to the side of the highway after we flagged them down. We then led them out to that concrete structure, where a human skeleton lay partially covered in leaf litter. They took one glance at it before one of them began speaking into his radio, stating that they required all manner of assistance to secure the crime scene and examine the remains. The officers posed numerous questions to us while awaiting their partner's arrival. But evidently no one truly had anything to disclose except for me. Again, I said nothing about my nightmares. I merely informed them about discovering the body after wandering off to use the restroom. Following that, since we were clearly not suspects, the police informed us that we were free to depart, but that they might be in contact. As we walked back to our camp, I felt awful for being such a killjoy. But I was so profoundly unnerved by finding those bones that I could not manage to settle myself again. So I asked Rachel if it would be all right for her to give me a ride back home. She assured me it was no trouble at all. We then jointly rolled our eyes when the boys declared there was no way they were leaving. They actually found it somewhat cool that I had found a body and wished to remain to see if the media would show up. And that was whatever. I suppose boys will be boys. Rachel had not mentioned what I had told her about my dream, and all they knew was that I had experienced that creepy sense of déjà vu. So I do not fault them for not fully comprehending why I could not remain. But I simply could not endure being there. As we drove away, it felt as though a colossal weight was being lifted from my chest and I could finally breathe again. Rachel dropped me off at my apartment and then decided she would stay with me overnight before driving back to the Catskills in the morning, as the boys still required a ride home. She must have inferred that I needed someone to confide in, and I truly did, because I could not reconcile the bizarre similarities between what I had witnessed in my dream and what I had discovered in those woods. I had never known anything to push my skepticism to its absolute limits, and it was not a pleasant experience. I did not know if I was losing my sanity, and I clung to the hope that there was some form of rational explanation for the events unfolding. Thankfully, it transpired that there was indeed a rational explanation. I had merely inadvertently postponed hearing it by avoiding conversation with the one person I needed to, my mother. And for reasons that should now be quite apparent, I had absolutely no intention of informing my mother about that camping trip. I did not wish to distress her or potentially instigate an argument, so I remained silent about it. I continued to keep my mouth shut for an entire 24 hours or so before I finally broke down and called her. She was not upset that I had gone to the Catskills. She was not angry that I hadn't told her either. She wasn't thrilled about it, but she appreciated that I was a grown woman capable of making my own choices. I recounted everything to her, from feeling peculiar to discovering that body. When I finished, she inquired where exactly we had visited, and I told her the Catskills. After a few seconds of silence, she asked for the precise location. Then, when I informed her we were camped near that reservoir, she exclaimed, "Oh God, let me call your father. I'll get right back to you when I'm done." She called back within minutes and then conveyed something along the lines of, "Sweetie, I need you to brace yourself, but the place you went missing when you were a kid, it was up near that reservoir. The reason why it felt like you'd been there before, it's because you have." I suppose these days I somewhat reprimand myself for not having connected the dots sooner. But I also believe it's a testament to the sheer power of the brain in terms of archiving memories one presumes to have forgotten. I ended up contacting the police officers who handled that body to try and fill in the narrative gaps a little. They did not possess the full story either, and initially they were not overly eager to share any specifics with me. However, when I mentioned that I had gotten lost in the area as a child and had these peculiar nightmarish memories about a monster entering the concrete structure, they suddenly became very interested in what I had to say. I will not delve into every detail of the conversation. It was lengthy and winding, touching upon much that I have already addressed. But this is the crux of it. I am 99% certain that I witnessed the person who subsequently died in that structure, which turned out to be a partially constructed housing for an electrical transformer or something similar, walk inside before their passing. The police stated that they surmised the individual was a hunter because scraps of camouflage clothing still clung to the skeleton's leg bones, which was likely why the monster in my dream possessed bark-like skin. And then, its hair that appeared like fire? Well, you guessed it, an orange hunting cover that transformed into flames in my nightmare. But what about the blood around that creature's mouth? Both I and the police conjectured that following some severe hunting accident, the individual realized they were dying and likely would not survive. So rather than perish out in the open where their body would almost certainly be dismembered by animals, they crawled into that half-built transformer housing and simply lay down and died in the hope that someone would eventually discover them. The only detail the police would not discuss with me, and not because they themselves were unaware, was the precise cause of the wound that killed the hunter. They knew. I am almost certain of it because they informed me they had completed a forensics examination of the bones. They simply would not confirm if it was a gunshot that killed the man, which might indicate murder, or if the wound had been inflicted by something like a sharp branch or a deer's antler, in which case it could have been nothing more than a tragic hunting accident. I would like to be able to claim that I assisted in some way too, but nothing I had to say contributed to the investigation other than roughly corroborating the date of the man's death, which the police already had an idea of anyway, thanks to their own methods. And I suppose the only beneficial outcome for me personally was the clarity and closure I gained from conversing with the police. It was an unparalleled sense of relief to know that I was not losing my mind, and that I had an excellent reason for feeling so disoriented in those woods. Especially those woods where I had been so terribly traumatized when I was just a toddler. I can only hope that someday they determine what transpired so that poor man can finally rest in complete and everlasting peace. Story 2. Ocala National Forest, an unforgettable ordeal. So I've been wanting to share this for a while now, and I thought your platform might be the appropriate place to do it. It's the account of how my boyfriend Andy and I, along with our friends Steve and Kathy, decided to go hiking in Ocala National Forest, located in northern Florida. It was intended to be an enjoyable week, just immersing ourselves in nature, away from work and all that. But it transformed into the most terrifying experience I've ever endured, and I am honestly trembling right now just contemplating it. It commenced so wonderfully. We drove up early on Saturday morning, eager to hit the trails. The weather was also perfect, sunny, warm, but not excessively hot. The forest was magnificent, with enormous trees and all sorts of birds chirping away. At one point, we had a close encounter with a deer just standing there, staring at us, and Steve even attempted to capture a picture, but it bolted before he could. So we hiked for several hours, not on some arduous trail, just a pleasant and easy one. We took numerous photographs, ate some snacks, and by the afternoon we were prepared to establish our camp. That's when we stumbled upon a spot that appeared to be a disused campground or perhaps even a trailer park. It was rather dilapidated, as if no one had been there in an eternity. There was a clearing, some old fire pits partially overgrown with weeds, and honestly, it felt perfect. We thought, yes, this is it, and it made us feel very adventurous. So we erected our tents, Andy and I in one, Steve and Kathy in the other, then gathered some firewood and settled in. That first evening was so much fun at the outset. We got a campfire blazing, and the aroma of burning wood simply made everything feel cozy. We had brought some beers, nothing too excessive, just enough to unwind. Kathy and I connected my small portable speaker to my phone and we played some music. We even danced around the fire a bit, probably looking like complete dorks, but we didn't care. It was one of those nights where you feel like nothing can go awry, like you're in your own little bubble, isolated from the rest of the world. We stayed up quite late, exchanging stories and jokes until we finally grew tired and crawled into our tents. I fell asleep quickly, feeling happy and warm beside Andy, thinking it was the finest weekend ever. And then, Everything descended into chaos. I don't even know what time it was, but I awoke abruptly. And then I detected it. Smoke, but a tremendous amount of it, far more than just a campfire. My eyes sprang open. I peered out the tent flap and my God, flames were everywhere. It appeared as though the entire forest was ablaze. It wasn't just a minor campfire gone awry. It was a colossal roaring wall of orange and red. And I could hear it too, a loud crackling and popping as if the entire world were consumed by fire around us. My heart began to pound so violently that I thought it would burst from my chest. I screamed and shook Andy awake, yelling, "Fire! Andy, wake up! There's a fire!" He bolted upright, saw it, and his face turned ashen. We could already feel the heat permeating the tent and the smoke was stinging our eyes. We had to move, and we had to move swiftly. We scrambled out barefoot, half panicked, and ran to Steve and Kathy's tent. I was shouting their names, slapping the fabric, and Andy was yelling, "Get up! We have to go now!" They stumbled out, looking bewildered and drowsy. But when they caught sight of the flames, they too panicked. We surveyed our surroundings, and the situation was dire. The fire was closing in on us from 3 sides rapidly. The only escape route was a patch of woods behind us that had not yet caught fire. I grabbed my phone and wallet from the tent floor. Andy snatched his flashlight, and Steve and Kathy also grabbed a few bare essentials. We abandoned everything, our bags, our food, the tents, all of it, and we ran for our lives. We fled into the woods, stumbling over roots and branches in the darkness. Andy's flashlight was erratically illuminating the path, barely lighting the way, and the smoke was thick, making breathing difficult, causing my lungs to burn. I could hear Kathy coughing behind me. Steve was urging us to keep going, and we could still perceive the glow of the fire behind us, a terrible orange light pursuing us through the trees. And I was utterly terrified, fully contemplating that we were going to die. My legs were trembling, but I simply kept running because what else could I do? And all I could think was, we have to get out. We have to get out. It was absolute pandemonium. Branches were scratching my arms, my bare feet were getting cut on the rocks, but I didn't care. We had to escape that fire at all costs. I kept glancing back, and it felt as though the flames were right at our heels, like some monstrous entity from a horror film. My mind was racing. How did this even happen? Did our campfire spread? Was it something else? Was it our fault? But there was no time to ascertain the cause. We were running blindly, hoping we would encounter a road or something, anything safe. And then, just when I thought it couldn't worsen, out of the darkness, these people materialized. I didn't even see them approach, and then they were obstructing our path. They appeared to be wearing masks fashioned from cloth, but with bizarre painted faces and rings around the eye holes. They also possessed weapons. Some wielded baseball bats, others belts, and one individual definitely had a chain, as I distinctly remember the sound it produced when he swung it. There were perhaps 5 or 6 of them, and they moved toward us so rapidly that we were largely helpless. Before I could even scream, they commenced assaulting us. One of them seized me by the hair and yanked me back so forcefully that I fell. I hit the ground, and then an excruciating pain exploded in my side where he jabbed me in the ribs with his bat. I screamed, curling up, attempting to shield myself, but he kicked me again directly in the stomach. I could hear Andy yelling, but then he grunted loudly, and I looked to see that the brute with the chain had whipped him across the back with it. He collapsed to his knees, and I thought I was going to lose my composure. Steve and Kathy were suffering terribly, and I witnessed Steve attempt to shield her, but one of them struck him in the shoulder with a bat, and he went down. Kathy was sobbing, trying to pull him up, but they just kept coming. It wasn't merely the physical assault that was bad enough. It was also the things they were uttering. And oh my God, it was the most repugnant, vile discourse I have ever heard. They were screaming that we were going to perish, that they would inflict horrific acts upon us first, things I cannot even transcribe because it sickens me. It was as if they derived pleasure from it, as if they desired us to be as terrified as possible. Every blow inflicted intense pain, and my arm felt as though it might be fractured. My legs were covered in cuts from falling and rising again. I was weeping, shaking, convinced that this was it, that they were going to murder us right there in the woods, with the fire roaring behind us. And that's when the realization struck me. It was probably them who ignited the fire precisely to herd us into their trap. I do not know how long it endured. It felt like hours, but it was likely only minutes. We continuously attempted to flee, dodging between trees, but they would pursue us, laughing and brandishing their weapons. Andy seized my hand at one point and pulled me up, and we simply bolted, not even observing where we were going. Steve and Kathy were directly behind us, I knew, because I could hear their gasping and crying. And then, quite suddenly, those thugs ceased pursuing us and began to yell. I do not understand why. Perhaps they were simply finished. But I do not believe so. I suspect something else out there frightened them. Something even more terrifying than weapon-wielding maniacs. Perhaps a rival group, a bear, who knows? But we did not linger to find out. We continued running, tripping over everything until we could no longer hear them and the trees began to thin out. We finally burst out of the woods into a small nearby town. I don't even recall how we arrived there, just that we were suddenly on a road, panting, bleeding. We were a complete mess, clothes torn, bruises and cuts everywhere, barefoot and trembling uncontrollably. We located the sheriff's office and practically collapsed through the door. The sheriff appeared shocked when he saw us, as though he could not believe his eyes. He offered us some water and we recounted everything, the fire, the masked individuals, all of it. My voice was shaky, I could barely articulate the words. He meticulously recorded everything and stated that he would dispatch someone to investigate. We proceeded to the hospital and the police officers went to the location we described. And indeed, everything was scorched. All of our belongings and a significant portion of the surrounding trees. There was no indication of that gang, obviously, and they did not sound like any of the young troublemakers in that area. I honestly still cannot believe it occurred. We were merely attempting to have an enjoyable weekend, and it transformed into this horrific nightmare that I cannot shake. I continuously envision those faces in my head, hear their voices, and feel the pain anew. And I haven't slept properly since. Every time I close my eyes, I am back in those woods, fleeing from the fire and those deranged individuals. Andy also experiences nightmares, and Kathy mentioned that Steve has been very quiet, as if he is still processing it, and we are all affected in our own unique ways. One question that continues to plague all of us is what could have been out there that instilled even more fear in those individuals than they wished to inflict upon us. So yes, I simply had to share this with someone. And I suppose I also wish to caution all of you. Exercise extreme care when venturing into those woods. I used to adore camping, hiking, and all such activities, but now I am terrified of it. You never know who might be out there with you. Unstable individuals like those thugs could be anywhere, concealed and awaiting. Inform someone of your destination. Adhere to less remote locations and perhaps refrain from camping at some eerie abandoned spot, as we decided. I do not know if the sheriff ever apprehended those individuals or what instigated the fire, but I no longer care. I simply desire for people to remain safe. This was the most dreadful night of my life, and I would not wish it upon anyone. Story 3. The Johnson Family Murders, a Canadian Tragedy. On August 2, 1982, the Johnson family journeyed from their residence in the rural Canadian community of Westbank to Wells Gray Provincial Park in British Columbia. The group comprised Bob and Jackie Johnson, both in their 40s, along with their two daughters, 13-year-old Janet and 11-year-old Karen. Accompanying them were Jackie's parents, George and Edith Bentley, who joined them for a 2-week camping vacation at a place called Bear Creek, near the site of an old, disused correctional facility. Intent on navigating the nearby creek, the family of experienced campers brought along a small boat, along with a camper van laden with food, water, and medical supplies. The Johnsons were prepared for almost anything, and it appeared that 2 weeks of wholesome woodland recreation awaited them. Yet, unbeknownst to all, they were destined to endure a tragedy of horrifying proportions. 2 weeks later, on the morning of August 16th, employees at Maplewood Timber Company noticed that one of their colleagues had failed to clock in. 44-year-old Bob Johnson was not the type of individual to simply not show up, but since his superior had been informed of his recent camping trip to Wells Gray, he granted Johnson a few days' grace to account for extenuating circumstances. The next day, he attempted to call Bob but received no reply. He tried again the subsequent day, but once more his call went unanswered. Finally, after a week of gradually escalating concern, Bob's boss reported him missing to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP. Search and rescue teams commenced scouring the area surrounding Bear Creek, the Johnson family's last known location. Yet to their bewilderment, neither the Johnsons nor their vehicles were anywhere to be discovered. What ensued were 4 weeks of fruitless searching and bitter frustration. Until finally, on September 13, 1982, a mushroom picker stumbled across a burned-out car in a woodland clearing not far from a steep logging road. This logging road was over 13 miles away from the location of the Johnsons' camp. Yet the wreckage bore an unsettling resemblance to the car in which the family had traveled to the park. After being alerted by the mushroom picker, RCMP officers were immediately dispatched to the scene. And upon their arrival, they made a chilling discovery. Following an examination of the burned vehicle's interior, officers found a pile of charred bones in the back seat. The remains were meticulously bagged and transported for analysis. And while many had hoped they might be nothing but animal bones, their worst fears were soon confirmed. The charred skeletons, which had been unceremoniously shoved into the car, doused in an accelerant and set alight, belonged to the missing Johnson family. In their subsequent investigation, police began interviewing local residents, one of whom claimed to have observed the Johnsons camping much further away from Bear Creek than initially anticipated. After pinpointing the location of the second campsite, a search was organized, and it did not take long to find some beer caps of the brand known to be consumed by Bob Johnson, along with 6 spent .22 caliber bullet casings. However, the Johnsons' 1981 Ford camper, not to mention the remainder of their possessions, were still nowhere to be found. For months, the investigation into the Johnson family's deaths failed to progress. In April of the following year, a television reenactment of the killings was filmed at the murder site, which was then broadcast across Canada. Police hoped the reenactment would yield fruitful leads, but despite being inundated with calls and tips, there were no breakthroughs in the case. Police even went so far as to create a replica of the family's Ford camper, down to the minutest detail, including the aluminum boat that had been strapped to its roof. Then, in the late spring of 1983, they drove the trailer all the way from British Columbia to Quebec, hoping that a sighting of it might prompt the correct person to come forward. It was a daring maneuver, but once again it yielded no tangible results. And despite receiving 1,300 alleged sightings, all were proven to be either at best mistaken identifications or at worst, malicious disinformation. Eventually, on October 18, 1983, a total of 14 months following the Johnson family's murders, their camper van was finally discovered by 2 forestry workers near Trophy Mountain. The location was just over 15 miles from the site of the murders and approximately 20 miles from where the Johnsons' car was found. Forensic investigators determined that, much like their car, some form of accelerant had been used in the torching of the camper van, most likely gasoline mixed with some other type of flammable liquid. It was also evident that someone had exerted significant effort to ensure the van was well hidden, and there was evidence someone had attempted to drive it into a nearby gorge, but a patch of fallen logs had obstructed their path. The RCMP had the van's burned-out remains airlifted to its Vancouver crime laboratory. But although its remnants provided no immediate clues, the location of its discovery proved to be of great interest to investigators. The abandoned logging road on Trophy Mountain, where the vehicle was found, was not easily accessible, with one local resident stating that only someone intimately familiar with the area would have been aware of such an isolated spot. In other words, the Johnsons' killer resided disturbingly close by. This theory spurred officers to return to their door-to-door canvassing with renewed intensity, and it was during this renewed period of questioning that they finally achieved a breakthrough in the case. After conversing with an unnamed member of a small rural community surrounding Wells Gray, police learned that around the same time as the murders, a man named David Shearing had inquired about repairing a hole in a car door, as well as how to re-register a vehicle. The 24-year-old lived 3 miles from the site of the murders, and on November 19, 1983, RCMP officers located Shearing north of Kamloops, where he was scheduled to appear in court on a stolen property charge. He was taken into custody and questioned extensively. What emerged was a classic narrative of the familial black sheep. Despite an extensive criminal record and a reputation for erratic behavior, Shearing's father earned his living as a prison guard, and his brother served as a sheriff in the provincial police force. He had been a diligent student, graduated high school, and completed a heavy mechanics course. And somewhere along the way, something went awry for young David. RCMP detectives Mike Eastham and Ken Lebo were convinced of Shearing's culpability and gained his trust by initially asserting that his arrest was completely unrelated to the Johnson family murders. In fact, they succeeded in making Shearing so comfortable that he consented to being questioned without legal counsel, thereby walking directly into the detectives' trap. As it happened, David Shearing was, in fact, one of the first individuals to have been interviewed by the RCMP following the discovery of the Johnson family's remains. The interview occurred in Shearing's backyard, situated approximately 1 mile from the murder scene, and through one of his home's windows, an officer observed a .22 caliber rifle hanging on the wall, the exact same type used in the murders. When questioned why they did not seize the firearm and test it to see if the casings fired from it matched those found at the scene, Inspector Vic Edwards cited basic rights preventing unlawful searches and seizures. "I don't have any right to go into your house and examine your guns," he stated. "The same as I didn't have any right to go into Mr. Shearing's house. We had no reason to suspect him." Initially, Shearing was led to believe that his arrest pertained to a hit-and-run incident before the detectives abruptly confronted him with their theories surrounding the Johnson murders. Then, in his explanation, Shearing inadvertently admitted to detectives that he had heard the murders were committed at Bear Creek, information that had not yet been released to the public. Then, after considerable effort and persuasive techniques, the two detectives managed to persuade Shearing to confess to all 6 Johnson family murders. He also agreed to reenact the murders to demonstrate to detectives precisely how events transpired, and even promised to surrender their possessions so they could be properly returned to their loved ones. But perhaps most crucially for the case, Shearing consented to relinquish the .22 caliber Remington pump-action rifle, which was forensically confirmed to be the murder weapon. Shearing initially confessed to shooting the 4 adults as they sat around their campfire. He then claimed to have shot the Johnsons' 2 daughters as they slept in their tent, and that his sole motivation for doing so was to rob them without risking any witnesses. He informed the interviewing detectives that after loading the Johnsons' bodies into their car, he drove it to the mountainside under cover of darkness and then set it on fire using 5 gallons of gasoline. He then attempted, but ultimately failed, to clean the campsite as thoroughly as possible, then drove the camper back to his home before burning it after discovering the re-registration process was too difficult. On the day Shearing's trial was scheduled to commence, he pleaded guilty to 6 counts of second-degree murder. As part of the guilty plea, Shearing stated the following: "I walked out of the bush from behind the camper and started shooting. I put the bodies in the car, 2 in the back seat, and the 2 little ones in the trunk. I poured the gasoline. It just went woof. And I stood back and watched it burn. I went to the tent. I knelt down and I shot the other 2. The court had no alternative but to accept Shearing's version of events, but to the detectives, his story did not resonate as entirely truthful. They instinctively knew he wasn't divulging the complete truth, but their intuition would not be confirmed until a later date. In his sentencing, Supreme Court Justice Harry McKay declared, "What we have very simply is a cold-blooded and senseless execution of 6 defenseless and innocent victims for no apparent reason." He continued, "The sentence I impose must express in clear terms the revulsion felt by the great majority of our citizens for this senseless and vicious mass killing. The victims were unknown to the prisoner. They did not provoke him in any manner. He was aware they were camped at the site and meticulously scouted the situation. He returned home and then came back either that night or the next with a loaded .22 rifle. Why? We do not really know, but the enormity of the crimes demand the maximum sentence." On April 17, 1984, Justice McKay sentenced Shearing to 6 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole for at least 25 years. It was the maximum possible penalty for second-degree murder and the first time in Canadian history it had been imposed. Shearing did not appeal his sentence. His mother, Rose Shearing, was stunned by the news of her son's conviction. "I hope it's a mistake or a bad dream," she stated. "He's always been such a good boy." Greg Shearing, David's brother, remarked, "I have a lot of questions I'd like to ask the police. I have a hard time believing all of this." Following Shearing's conviction, Detective Mike Eastham, who had long harbored suspicions of Shearing's deceitfulness, pleaded for an opportunity to re-interview him to uncover the full truth. When he obtained it, it was just as unsettling as he had envisioned. At one point during the interview, Detective Eastham told Shearing, "You know why I'm here? I think you abused those girls before you killed them. You told me some time ago that you would consider telling me the rest of the story after you were sentenced. Well, now I'm here to collect." It was only then that David Shearing disclosed what truly happened to the Johnsons' 2 daughters. Shearing confessed that after first spotting the Johnson family camped near Bear Creek, he spent several days secretly observing them. He admitted to harboring profoundly inappropriate thoughts towards 13-year-old Janet and 11-year-old Karen, and became resolute in his determination to abuse them, even if it necessitated murdering their parents. Finally, on the evening of August 10th, Shearing entered the campsite with his rifle and then shot all 4 adults in cold blood. Janet and Karen had been asleep in their tent, and the sound of the gunshots awoke them. Shearing falsely reassured them that he and their parents were safeguarding them from bad men, then proceeded to dispose of the adults' bodies. Once he was finished, he crawled into the tent with the girls and subjected them to acts of unforgivable depravity. The following morning, after ensuring their parents' bodies were covered with a blanket, Shearing transported Janet and Karen to a nearby fishing shack. It was here he intended to continue the abuse. In a stunning twist of fate, the shack was approached by none other than an officer from Guardian Corrections who was overseeing a fishing trip for well-behaved prisoners. The Guardian Corrections officer visited the cabin to reassure Shearing regarding their presence in the area. But before he came to the door, Shearing concealed the girls in another room, instructed them to remain quiet, then engaged in a brief conversation with the correctional officer without once arousing the man's suspicion. The next day, he moved the girls to his family farm. Then on August 16th, he led them into a patch of woodland near one of his fields and shot them both in the head. He reportedly instructed the girls to turn around so he could urinate, and then he shot them execution style. Shearing then took the bodies back to the Johnson family car, placed the girls' bodies in the trunk, and burned it. To confirm Shearing was now telling the truth, Detective Eastham tracked down the prison guard the killer was referring to. The Guardian Corrections officer remembered the meeting precisely as Shearing had described it. And when Eastham's partner, a Constable Leal, hiked through the woods to pay a personal visit to the cabin, he found 2 sets of initials carved into the wood. DS for David Shearing and JJ for Janet Johnson. The initials had been enclosed within a crudely carved heart shape, a detail which made Leal's skin crawl. The same detective later reflected on how close the prison guard had been to saving Janet and Karen's lives. "That's how close everyone was," he stated. "But for a cruel act of fate, those 2 precious little girls would be alive today." In 1995, Shearing married a woman from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. Heather Andis, who encountered her bloodthirsty spouse in 1993, asserted that her husband deserved a second chance. "I have seen so much change in this man since we met," she declared. "I know the man's heart is in the right place, and I'm just here to back him up." In September 2008, exactly 24 years following his conviction for the Johnson family murders, David Shearing finally became eligible for parole. Yet, thankfully, the Canadian National Parole Board ruled that since he had not completed sex offender treatment and was rumored to still harbor violent fantasies, he was not yet prepared for freedom. His second application, filed in 2012, was also rejected when a petition bearing almost 14,000 signatures was presented to the National Parole Board. Shearing applied again in 2014 but mysteriously withdrew the request a month before his hearing. Perhaps he has grown weary of attempting to deceive the parole board into believing he is a safe, sane, and stable human being. Or perhaps he has acknowledged that he poses a danger to wider society and has resigned himself to being sequestered from it for the remainder of his natural life. We may never ascertain Shearing's reasons for withdrawing his appeal, and while some of us might desire to comprehend his thought process, I would caution against delving into the mind of a man who murdered 2 innocent couples in order to prey on their 2 young daughters. By